I have quite big concerns about the West as a collective. I don't really like the term either because it's a monolith, and we're talking about what, 45, 50 plus nations in the West, which all have different ideologies, cultures, and histories and so on. What does this mean for the Western cohort, if you like, or group of countries in this fragmented world or multipolar world?
Well, I think that, first of all, a multipolar world has existed for a very long time throughout human history. And as I said, it tends to last longer than people think. The 19th century being a very good example of this. And I don't think it really means anything negative. Multipolarity doesn't, it could end with some sort of non-Western global hegemony. Let's say in that dramatic scenario where like China wins, the West is still going to be the West. Why do I say that? Well, China continued to be China, even during their century of humiliation. Like, guess what? The West, even the empire as strong as the United Kingdom or America.
This is the Global Gambit.
When it comes to geopolitics, we often just, talk about it. But what I try to do here on the Global Gambit is do more of a job of blending in the macroeconomics, because geopolitics affects the economy, affects the way that we consume things, the way that trade is done, inflation, employment, so many different factors. And I think a lot of the time we can overlook them. So with that in mind, I wanted to interview someone who can help us blend those together. And, I'm going to be honest, he's someone I think does a fantastic job. The best person, because he's written one of the best books I can find about it, Marco Papic, Chief Strategist of GeoMacro Strategy at BCA Research. And, an expert around global macro geopolitics, as he's made very clear in his book, The Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. And in this two-part conversation, I wanted to speak with Marco about the relationship of geopolitics to global macro, how great powers seemingly interact now, and what impact that has for the biggest economies around the world. What does this mean for the Russia-Ukraine war when we have systemic challenges? Are we in inflection points? Are we in, as I'm now calling, obviously, not the international order, the international disorder? But Marco, it's a delight to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time. The first question I really want to ask you is you could argue maybe a bit conceptual, but why do we have such a bad time of sort of interlinking geopolitics or global political events and global economic events? Because they seem to be quite distinguished. I think they're quite intertwined.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Pyotr. I think that's a great way to start and a great question. And I think it's because we've over-professionalized, over the past 40 years. If you look at academia, if you look at corporates, financial firms, we have created these very segmented, very separate realms. And that's because many of the tools that we're teaching through those realms haven't really been relevant. As you said, you struggle to interview people who actually make geopolitics their day-to-day job. I do. And I do because the financial industry in particular, if you think of it as an epistemic community, a community of people who share certain knowledge, narratives, and traits, that community has really become bereft of understanding of politics and geopolitics, in large part because they didn't need it. Since the 1980s, geopolitics has been really a tailwind. It's been unidirectional. American hegemony reduced a lot of geopolitical volatility. While on the domestic political front, laissez-faire beat out dirigist policies of the 1970s. So you had Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher effectively, ossify this particular view of how economics and macroeconomics should be applied on the societal level. And those two things just made people think that less government is good, that less government will always be the direction of government on the domestic political scene, and on the geopolitical scene, that really geopolitical risks are a domain of sort of the emerging markets or frontier markets. Think about it. The premier geopolitical risk consultancy is named Eurasia Group because its founder, Ian Bremmer, was an expert on Central Asian republics, the STANs. And so when he first pitched it to investors, he was like, hey, I can help you, figure out Turkmenistan. And certainly I'm not going to do anything about the developed world because that doesn't matter. Obviously, they've pivoted as everyone else has as well. And I think that's why. I think that, putting all these disciplines into separate buckets was a luxury we had in this very ordered world, as you point out. Now that we're back to what I like to call not so much disorderly world, but we're back in the 19th century. I think it's time for us to become more holistic individuals, professionals, like we were in the 19th century. 19th century, an investor, a global investor, would have been completely confused by our separation of finance, markets, macroeconomics, and political science into different disciplines. They would have said, no, I'm just an investor. I need to use all of these tools to do my job. And I think that was the case for a C-suite executive in the late 19th century. It was a case for somebody trying to, improve humanity through maybe NGO work, although NGOs obviously weren't called NGOs at the time. But the point is that I think we need to go back to that 19th century mentality, which is that all this stuff matters. And you can't just be over professionalized and get yourself a nice CFA certification and think that that makes you an investor.
I think that's a very apt answer. And without making it too personal, but I think actually in my own career, I have experienced this because I'm probably what most people label a generalist, right? In the sense of I've studied international relations, economics, strategic studies, but at quite a macro level. But then I've worked predominantly in the multilateral sector, like the World Bank or the UN. And then sort of you're maybe I want to shift towards the private sector. I know, for different motivations, right? And the siloedness or sort of segregation that has existed between the different disciplines and industries is quite remarkable, but also incredibly disconcerting for me. And it's incredibly frustrating as someone, not just myself, but anyone maybe of a younger age who wants to get into risk analysis or geopolitical analysis, but then you find that the applications are still very geared to as you say, sort of 20th century approach, when really it's all interconnected these days. And sort of it seems to be that we're ahead of the curve, as in people who are studying it in younger generations, but the institutions or the organizations still haven't really caught up to that. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but I find it's been quite, from my own personal experience, very much reflective of what you say.
Well, no, and it's actually how it's being applied still to this day. I mean, there was a raft of investment banks who have actually started geopolitical units. I don't know if you noticed that, but there was a lot of reports over the last, 24 months about that. Lazard did this, JP Morgan.
McKinsey have done this. Yeah, no, plenty of them, yeah.
Yes, but for the most part, all of them do it by just pretty much picking out of retirement, past expiration date policymakers, and sort of incocks them in this almost like institute level, it's just kind of like an academic chair almost. And why don't you just write and produce some glossy PDFs from time to time? I don't think that's really going to be helpful, because geopolitical and political analysis has to be integrated into the very workflow. It's not something exogenous. It has to be endogenous to the process of selecting new markets for your product. If you're a corporate just trying to sell a widget, if you're an investor, thinking about how politics and geopolitics underpins your market assumptions that you're basing your strategic asset allocation on, that's something that has to be inherent. And to do that, I think you need to hire young people. You need to hire young people, teach them finance, teach them your corporate brand, whatever it is that you do, but hire them with the expertise. And so that's where I do think this is on the leadership in the corporate and financial world. On the other hand, I do also want to say it's also up to young people to understand that when you show up, you got to know something, and you can't, and what I mean by that is trying to start with a generalist outlook is very difficult, and the reason is that no one hires you at 25 so you can connect the dots. That's just impossible. And so what I always advise younger people is come in with a specific set of, knowledge, whether it's geographical, focus yourself on a particular region or an asset class. Maybe you're really interested in energy markets. That's cool. You can go, by the way, you can go to, schools and programs such as the one you went, which I think is actually the best, SAIS. You can go there and you can do a thesis. And I mean,
my audience are going to log off now. They're like, oh, his head's even bigger than it was already.
No, but I think once you go there, I think choosing something that will build those skill sets that make you hireable. Because again, no one's going to hire you to connect the dots. That's difficult. I started my career as a Europe expert, which, back in the early 2000s was sort of like being the admiral of the Swiss Navy. I mean, that's a joke I put in my book. Nobody really cared about Europe. It wasn't a source of risk. It wasn't a source of geopolitical alpha. It was just on an inexorable path towards greater integration. Like Lisbon Treaty was like the big question, and then of course it became the epicenter of the planet because the euro area crisis actually in 2010, 11, 12 drove markets everywhere. So I got lucky in that way, but it was that expertise in something that allowed me to learn how to become an expert at something. Once you've done it once, maybe if the first time becoming an expert takes 3 to 5 years, the second time it's 1 to 2 years, then it's 6 months, and then you become a generalist. But it's that process of actually becoming a true, genuine, like 0.1% expert at something that every young person, I always say, has to go through before they can kind of get to a point of connecting the dots.
Well, do you think that it's a case of, well, I personally do think this, but would you agree or slightly differ maybe on the emphasis that, with political analysis or sort of, it comes with age a little bit, like it's unlikely you're going to be able to command authority in an area like geopolitical risk analysis or something without years of experience of working within, I don't know, the political theatre or in diplomacy or in the markets or something like that. Because I like to think I know what I'm talking about to an extent, but, I'm younger than perhaps some other people, and so it's not as possible. So when you're trying to get involved in an industry like geopolitics or understand how it works and apply it to market analysis, is that a bit of an Achilles heel?
I'm laughing, Pyotr, because my first CEO, and God bless him, he made my career. But I remember right when he hired me, he ended the meeting saying, like, don't ever shave your beard off.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Which I think was like inappropriate in today's world, but like I totally got it. He was trying to help me. And I was 29 and I was given a fairly senior position here at the firm I work at, BCA Research, which is a 76-year-old institution, experts at macro. That was what he said. So there is some truth to what you're saying. That is definitely the perception. But the way I would say it is that you wouldn't hire an ex-CEO of Boeing to do your defense and aerospace analysis, like sectoral equity analysis. You wouldn't. That would be silly, because they have no idea how to analyze aerospace and defense stocks. They just don't. I mean, they know more than you and I probably do because they were CEO of one, but that's not what they're good at. And so why would you hire an ex-policymaker to do political analysis? Like having led a country, God bless you, you're clearly, a very ambitious and incredibly inspirational individual, but you have no idea how to do comparative political or geopolitical analysis. You just don't. You're not trained in it. You've never done it. In many ways, one of the biggest problems, I think, in hiring, older, experienced policymakers, politicians, ex-politicians, the problem with them is that they've gone their entire career thinking that they can change the world for the better. Hopefully that's what they went through. Maybe some of them tried to enrich themselves, but let's leave that aside. The point is that these individuals are quite often completely unaware of how material constraints shape their behavior. And we elect them because of that. Just to be clear, you're a great politician if you want to overcome the tragedy of great power politics. You're a great politician because you want to overcome the context in which your country finds itself. That's what makes you great, because you push against it. But I, as an analyst, I need to focus on those constraints. And so I actually don't need somebody who thinks that smoke-filled rooms is where the future of mankind is decided, because quite often it isn't. It's decided by structural factors that can be measured quantitatively, that can be thought of in systemic ways. So anyways, all I'm saying is that I do think you're very right. I think this emphasis on experience, age, and particularly experience in government is a huge mistake that most corporates and financial firms make. I have never worked in government. I will never work in government. I can promise you that. And I consider myself an analyst. Like, I'm a nerd. I'm a dispassionate, aloofly indifferent, nihilist who approaches countries as if they're bacteria in a petri dish. That is my job, and I wear that very proudly as like, that is my professionalism. And I think we need to train young people in how to do that. And I think that will make it much easier for many who are in positions of corporate power to actually see how this is useful for their day-to-day.
Yeah, it's, again, something I want to just sort of, I can use my own experiences with this, I guess is the best way to frame it. But I remember having a conversation with the head of the department for HSBC, the second largest bank in the world. This was like an informational interview. You know, if anyone's ever used to the grind of job hunting, right? You try to gain an understanding of a position or a sector by maybe speaking to people who are already in it. And she was in the position, she had been for 15 years, maybe she still is. She was lovely. They had 4 people, not just in the UK HSBC branch, globally. There were 4 people working in HSBC for geopolitical risk analysis. I mean, this was probably 2019 now, but like the point being is at the time, it was incredible to know just how niche and sort of underrepresented or sort of a lack of a priority bank as big as HSBC saw it. I think it was probably 2019. So obviously the global risks, you know, COVID, the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, all these elements have obviously heightened it. And I remember an article in the Financial Times last year emphasizing that geopolitics was to be one of the biggest metrics for financial consideration in the future, right? If you look at any annual publication from, say, a financial institution saying, you know, the big risks, geopolitics is now up there as high as sort of the economy or nuclear war or climate risks or something like that. So I think it's a reflection of the times, but it is quite unusual to see how sort of dismissive the attitude towards geopolitics has been. But do you think it's very much based on a needs versus a case by case sort of situation, or we are in that perpetual state of crises now when it comes to geopolitical issues?
Well, I think, first of all, I think most organizations, they're led by people who have lived in this tailwind era of American hegemony and dominance of laissez-faire. So they have no idea how to integrate this. You know, they're in their 50s and 60s. At no point in their life has geopolitics or politics really mattered for them professionally, like ever. And so they're confused. So the easy way is to create a team like the one you described. Like, let's have 4 or 5 people. And I mean, in many ways, HSBC is much better off than many others because others don't even have that. I actually think that's a mistake, though. I would not change what the firm does. You know, having a geopolitical unit is almost like having like a sustainability unit. You know, it shows that you actually don't care. You know, if you need to have a unit that does this, they're kind of exogenous. They're sitting in some like part of your office. You forget about them. They publish a PDF every quarter. It's nice. The layout and design team has some fun because they get to make some sustainability leaves, you know. And to me, what I would do if I was a head of an organization is I would just hire people with different, diverse views, methods. You know, that's what makes a holistic organization. It's not hiring a bunch of past expiration date policymakers to pretend like you care. No, it's hiring people from a size program and saying like, look, you're going to trade. We're going to teach you how to do that. We don't need, you know, size to teach you how to be an investor. No. We know how to be an investor. But we want you because you have these skill sets. And I think that's where it starts. You know, if I was going to send a message to CEOs and CIOs of various corporates and financial firms, I would say like, look, forget about adding this expertise from the top, create it from the bottom, you know, and hire a more holistic labor force. When we talk about DEI, when we talk about diversity, it's not diversity of what we look like. It's what we think and what we know. And that's where it starts. So stop hiring people who just, you know, got their CFA and went to finance degrees. Have a more holistic labor force. That will make you more resilient when geopolitical issues come up. Because to answer your question, it's a very simple answer. We are in the world we're in. We're not going anywhere else. It's not going to be resolved either through a World War III. We're not all going to die. Like, I don't have that view. It's also not going to become more like it was, quote unquote. You use disorder and order. I don't like those terms because I think the kind of a world we're in, I think in your email to me, you said it was referred to at the Munich conference as multiplex. It's the first time I've ever heard of that. Thank you for sharing that. I would just refer to it the way political scientists have referred to it for half a century, which is a multipolar world. A multipolar world can sustain itself for 50, 100 years. And so we may be in this messiness, which a lot of us think is disorder. I just think it's how humans have actually organized states on the planet for majority of their existence. So I think we can be in this state of affairs for 50, 100 years. And what that will require is that we start hiring more holistic, diverse labor force from the very beginning.
But what does this mean for the West, right? Because I am a product of the end of the Cold War, this bipolar world, which led to this unipolar world or hegemon of the United States, right? It's primacy. And, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do with the channel or when I interview guests or in my own analysis is I'm never going to say I'm unbiased. So everyone's biased. It's just more whether or not you're able to acknowledge your own limitations and adjust accordingly, right? More specifically, like I'm a product of Russian Western influences together. But one of the biggest emphasis people are talking about it is the West is declining, the United States is declining, and China's rising or whatever, you know, other words, phrases that we can talk about, right? I have quite big concerns about the West as a collective. I don't really like the term either because it's a monolith and we're talking about what 45, 50 plus nations in the West, which all have different ideologies, cultures, and histories, and so on. But you know, what does this mean for the Western cohort, if you like, or group of countries in this fragmented world or multipolar world?
Well, I think that, first of all, a multipolar world has existed for a very long time throughout human history. And as I said, it tends to last longer than people think. The 19th century being a very good example of this. And I don't think it really means anything negative. You know, multipolarity doesn't, I mean, it could end with some sort of non-Western global hegemony. But even in that, let's say in that dramatic scenario where like China wins, the West is still going to be the West. Why do I say that? Well, China continued to be China, even during their century of humiliation. Like, guess what? The West, even the empire as strong as the United Kingdom or America, have not been able to force the Chinese to speak English and convert into Judeo-Christian traditions. You know, like, so in other words, to answer your question, nothing will happen to the West. Like, powers may rise and fall. And yes, you know, on some level, you may have to become a vassal state of a very important empire, as many Greek city-states were to Persia. They fought against their fellow Greeks, against their fellow Westerners, if you will, on behalf of Persia, when there was that obviously epic, you know, war between the two. But it doesn't mean that the West just ends. No empire, no matter how strong in the history of mankind, has ever been able to completely eviscerate the socio-cultural sinews that give us differences. That's why we still have a Persian culture in Iran. It's why we still have China. It's why we still have India. It's why we still have Russia. They haven't melded completely. And so I am utterly unafraid for the future of the West. The other question, though, is, does this mean that there's a, you know, is the West in decline? I would simply say in relative terms, and this is where we need to know some mathematics. I don't think America is like falling off the cliff. The US is not declining in absolute terms. It's only perceived to be declining because the rest of the world is rising in their capabilities. That is it. And I think on some level, you know, that's not a negative. Obviously, it's perceived as a negative, but I don't think it's really negative in a long-term perspective.
Well, that may be all well and true, but in the book, I think World Cycles or whichever it is, Ray Dalio's book about, you know, the Dutch empire being replaced by the British and then the American replacing the British and now China, right? I personally do agree that I don't think America is in absolute decline. It's in relative decline because China and other countries are coming up. America's more just plateauing or maybe dripping, you know, ebbing and flowing and sort of static, right? You don't always have to be in an upward or downward motion. And I think that that's something that has become quite a big obsession amongst economists, is that we've got to measure things by purely always growth instead of maybe welfare or development or refinement, if that makes sense. Like an economy is not doing well because it's not growing. Well, maybe it doesn't need to grow. Maybe we just need to improve the existing things as it is. And I think that's what some of the advanced economies in Europe, for example, are beginning to sort of argue, is that the metrics that we currently use to judge prosperity, progression, or whatever is a bit simplistic. But, you know, you talk about in your book, which I did actually want to reference, is that sort of constraints matter more than preferences. Is that something that you are seeing apply to the West, that we do have more constraints, like, well, say a debt issue, or, you know, well, the UK, we're running out of money. How does the West navigate this?
No, I don't think that's a real constraint. Constraints are very, very important in predicting short-term geopolitical and political events. So material constraints, in my view, are more diagnostic than the preferences of politicians that we try to predict. So whether Vladimir Putin wants to conquer Kiev or not, I don't really care what his preference is. I want to create a matrix of constraints that will tell me what will be the political path of least resistance, to his behavior over the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years. But when it comes to like the future of the West, that's when, I don't want to become overly indexed to constraints. That's really long-term forecasting. And I think that what matters more are the kind of things that, Acemoglu and Robinson won the Nobel Prize in economics for, which is their work on kind of what makes nations succeed and fail. What are the sinews that underpin innovation, entrepreneurialism, productivity, technological growth? Like that matters to me much more. And so I think that the decline of the West is a byproduct of the fact that it's been in charge for so long. And it's become complacent and it's become, quite unfocused on things that matter. I think there is the Peter Turchin argument of elite overproduction, which I'm sympathetic to as well. And I think that there just hasn't been much competition to the West, to the US over the last 40 years. And so inevitably, it was kind of asleep at the wheel as some other powers rose. And so in many ways, I would say, Pyotr, that this moment of competition is exactly what the West needs. And I don't speak that as a proponent of one or the other system. I'm just saying, like, look, if you're in Team West, I think the fact that China is now finally offering some true competition, that's where innovation, productivity, technological progress will come from. It will come from a challenge. It's not going to come from just being on top. And so, and by the way, if you look at the history of many empires, sorry to cut you off, like there are these moments when there's a big victory and countries kind of like go sideways and then they rise to the challenge. The Rome defeated Carthage in Punic Wars, but it was really another 150 years until Rome became an empire. It was not until it was kind of challenged by some of the Germanic barbarians, quote unquote, that it said like, we're just going to take it all. We're going to take all of Europe. We're not satisfied just because we defeated Carthage. And you could see even the United Kingdom as well as an empire had these moments of sort of a lull, some challenges. The United Kingdom rose to the occasion in the late 19th century after having defeated Napoleon 100 years earlier. So I'm not worried about these interregnums, but I do think they last much longer than most of my clients think, because most of my clients are asking, when does China take over? Or when does America come back? Because all they can think of is in unipolar or bipolar frameworks. And I just respond like, guys, we're not going anywhere. We are exactly where we are. We're in this complicated, messy world where, it's not just China versus US. It's a lot of different, countries all competing with one another. And I quite frankly think this is going to be the greatest period in perhaps human history in terms of technological innovation, because it is this challenge, it is this rivalry, it's this geopolitical competition between multiple states that will lead to some really interesting, nonlinear, difficult to predict technological innovation that ultimately rises all boats over the long period of time. So if you look at the 19th century in particular, almost everything we consider a great piece of innovation occurred between 1870 and like 1925. That was a period in which humanity became modern. Sure, we didn't have, this. So you couldn't order a cheeseburger at 3 a.m. after your date leaves that you got on another app. We didn't have that. Like, oh no, what tragedy. But we became a modern society with modern technology between 1870 and 1925. And it was, I think, because of this competition between states that gave a little bit of tension and stress to everyone. So we had to actually do things that mattered. And I think that's where that pressure builds diamonds kind of a view. So I'm not too worried about the West. I'm not too worried about humanity. I think that competition is good.